Hi again, and welcome to the next part of the Major Arcana series that I'm doing. Today we're going to be talking about the High Priestess, number 2, or just the Priestess if you're using Crowley's deck. And of course she looks like this. Okay, this is another one of my favorites, though she is of course very esoteric and mysterious and all these things that the priestess is usually associated with anyway. But I think she just her her associations are pretty difficult, I think. And I think the confusion stems from the nature of the entity that we call in Western magical science, so to speak, the HGA, or the Holy Guardian Angel. And because of the confusion of what exactly this entity is, I think that's what makes the priestess so confusing for me, um, given what Crowley says about her. Um, so to start, she is the letter Gimel, which means a camel, basically, and is the letter G, of course. And Gimel essentially is the idea that well, of course, she connects Kether, number 1, to Tiphareth in number 6. And anything below the number 3 is considered more tangible than the supernal triangle. It's called Sephiroths. The Sephiroth number 1 through 3 are called the supernal triangle because they exist in the unmanifested ideal plane of existence. They are not remotely describable with basic, usually basic things. And they're all, it's sort of similar to the Christian Trinity. They're all contained, the masculine and the feminine of Chokmah and Binah, respectively, are contained within Kether. They are direct reflections and emanations of Kether, but they're really interesting. So in other words, the High Priestess is that path which directly connects the highest with, or the supernal triangle, or what is even called macroprosopis, the greater face of God, with what is called microprosopis, the lesser face of God, in Tiphareth. Um, so essentially, the difference is between God the Father and Kether, or conceivably even the entire Trinity, as Crowley would say. Crowley suggests that Kether is the entire masculine Christian Trinity of Father, Son, Holy Ghost in one Sephiroth. And Tiferet, in that case, Tiferet is of course associated with dying gods and resurrection gods, saving gods, gods that sacrifice themselves for the betterment of mankind, basically, for the betterment of the world, really, not just mankind. And so, of course, the obvious correlation there is with Christ, uh, and particularly the passion of Christ. But Christ is man, Deus est homo, as opposed to Christ pre-incarnation as conceptualized by being coexistent and co-substantial with the Father and the Holy Spirit and all that doctrinal mumbo jumbo. But it's important because there is a difference between the manifested Christ consciousness and the macrocosmic, architect of the universe type of consciousness. Um, the logos as opposed to the incarnated logos. So, anywho, the idea is that the priestess is the linking path between those two ideas, which is incredibly interesting to me. Tiferet is essentially the heart of the individual consciousness. It's essentially the solar center around which one's subjective universe in manifestation revolves. But the idea is that it is really only a basically an idea of Kether because it is the direct image of Kether, basically. Now, this is important because the priestess, um, Crowley tells us that the priestess is associated with Ein Sof Or, which means unlimited light. So of course, excuse me, this completes our triad of the three veils of the negative. The Fool represented the Ein, the Magus represents the Ein Sof, and the Priestess represents Ein Sof Or. And again, all three of these things really are totally undefinable because they are nothingness, or some aspect of nothingness that the old Kabbalists thought were relevant. So the idea is that the limitless light is basically the image of God. It's kind of one of the highest ways you can conceptualize God, because God is formless. Remember, God cannot be contained by any form, and yet it's also unmanifest. So it's the basically it comes across as being akin to, though not equal to, limitless light. Okay, and that's what the priestess is supposed to represent. The fact that it's limitless connects to her nature as a virgin, her whiteness on the card, her purity, all these things. The fact that she can never lose her virginity or her fertility is very interesting. But the idea that the priestess represents an image of God is particularly relevant given its path. We were just talking about how Tiphareth is also like the direct manifested image of God in one's consciousness. Basically, it's how Jesus says, "No one may come to the Father except through me." You can only understand God through the image of God, basically. And that's what Christ was getting at, I think, is that, and the whole Christian mythos is getting at, is that it's necessary to understand how God manifests itself and the image that God takes, in order to fully understand the whole picture and in order to get deeper, with any level of understanding. So, so the priestess, basically, getting back to the Holy Guardian Angel bit and trying to put this all together now, because I've given you a lot of information, but the Holy Guardian Angel is essentially Christ, or Jesus Christ, the man, God incarnate. And the Holy Guardian Angel is meant to be one's personal deity, basically, one's personal guide and teacher par excellence, for initiation, basically, and initiation being knowledge of God, really. My mic is very low, I'm realizing. Hope you can even hear all this. Let me just raise this a little bit. Okay, sorry about that. Right. So the issue comes when Crowley tells us in his multiple writings. First, he says that the Holy Guardian Angel is a reflection of one's highest self, or true self, basically, that it's the image one receives of one's true self, that being in Kether. Then he says later in life that the HGA is not that at all, and that was a blasphemy, and that the HGA is really some higher being that has already attained enlightenment in a previous existence, and whose duty it is, basically whose universal civic duty is to help someone attain enlightenment as well. Do with this as you will. I think if you're accepting that the priestess is supposed to be a representation of the Holy Guardian Angel, as Crowley says in the Book of Todd, it's kind of difficult to make it all work when you're using his latter concept. It's kind of difficult to explain. It's just, if Kether is really, the true self concealed on the subjective level, if Kether is really the true self contained within a being, and the priestess is the path that connects it to Tiphareth, and really is the emanation of Kether into Tiphareth, is the essence of Kether in Tiphareth, then it doesn't make sense for it to be a being anything other than Kether, which is self. So, you know, if we're using tarot for these understanding these Kabbalistic doctrines, then my opinion is that Crowley's doctrine makes absolutely no sense in his later life. I think he was probably more correct in his the beginning of his life, or whenever he was espousing the former doctrines of the Holy Guardian Angel being a reflection of selfhood. I realize this is confusing, but just things to think about this card. It's very important to think about these things with these cards, because this is why the Priestess represents the initiator into the mysteries of the subconscious and all that she is traditionally associated with. So let's see. Is there anything else I can say about her? What's always interested me about this card is the bow she has on her lap. And I'm not sure what we can say about that. Crowley says that she has the bow because she's connected to Artemis, the Greek goddess of virginity and the moon, and you know, Diana the huntress as well. And he says that she hunts by enchantment, is the quote. And this is kind of an interesting thing. It's the idea that God does not speak to us in normal ways, that God speaks to us in a number of subtle and mysterious ways that are always concealed. The priestess being, you know, the fascinating aspect of this card that Lady Frida Harris and Crowley decided upon is that if you notice, the veil in this card is really the web of light she's weaving in front of her. And so it's in front of her as opposed to behind her. In the Pamela Coleman Smith drawing, or painting rather, the veil is behind her, and this has a separate meaning. Crowley is saying, and Lady Frida Harris are saying, that that the priestess represents limitless light, or the essence of God contained in form, basically. The form of Tiphareth, the something, the manifested being, the pure being of Tiphareth. And you can see that on the bottom. We've got all these fruits and flowers here and precious stones. And the idea is that, you know, of course, Tiferet means beauty, so all these things are very lovely. But the idea is that the priestess is the truth concealed within those forms, that those forms, as we talked about in the Magus, are really illusions, and the truth concealed within those things is the presence of God. The priestess. And the priestess is also associated with the Shekinah, which in Kabbalistic ideology represents God's presence on earth. And so it's the same thing. The Shekinah is basically equivalent to the Ark of the Covenant, basically. It's where God manifests himself on earth. And of course, since God is everything and everyone, the idea is that form is only an encasement and an illusory failed attempt to characterize God. So again, the priestess is very complicated, but this is also why she represents truth, and a very very important truth that is very difficult to see in everyday life. It's something that one has to see, I think, with different eyes, different perspective, and that is what the process of initiation is getting at, I think. So right, I think I've about summed it up. Getting back to Gimel, which is where I started, and just wrapping that up. The camel is a nice allegory or for crossing the desert, and of course the desert is the abyss, that which separates ideal consciousness from regular consciousness. The abyss is basically the dispersal of any unity, Crowley says, which is very confusing. I find the abyss almost more confusing than the supernal triangle, but only because it's another type of thing that you can say very little about, because it's just utter dispersal. It's forms that want to claim a coherency but cannot because there is no guiding will in them. It's essentially, and I suppose it would be godlessness at its highest form, because if God is always something that has its own will and is always a unity, a God is always a unity, then anything that cannot claim unity is therefore anti-divine, basically, and is the closest thing I think you can get to a real demon of sorts. And of course, Karanzan, or whatever the heck you pronounce his name, the supposed Lord of the Abyss in the magical philosophy, is basically the closest thing to a real Satan type figure as you can get. And of course, he's not particularly a great force. He's a force of utter chaos for no reason, as opposed to the chaos of the Fool, which sort of has a very high, lofty reason and purpose. So yeah. However, at the same time, interaction with this being results in the shedding of the ego, basically. When you pass the abyss, you can no longer lay claim to an ego or a separate sense of existence. Your attachment to your subjective self has been basically destroyed. And so some people would suggest that Karanzan is actually a good thing. As dangerous as he is for one's sanity, um, if one can overcome him, it's actually a very wonderful thing. And that is how you reach Binah, understanding, and essentially the first beginning of enlightenment. Okay, so I think that's all I can really say about that. Well, the bow, getting back to the bow, I keep, as you know, these videos are not particularly organized. I kind of just ramble about them for about 20 minutes. It's very free form. But to return to the bow, the other interesting thing about the bow is that the bow is always, and arrow, is always a symbol of willpower. And so we are reminded that the middle path that the priestess is part of on the Tree of Life, the middle path being balance, uh, is attained by following one's true will, basically, by following one's natural course and not fighting against it. One attains truth, basically, truth and knowledge of selfhood. So that's another thing implied in the priestess. And also the priestess is the planet of the moon. The moon is, of course, the highest aspect of, in this case, it's the highest aspect of the divine feminine. And it is also associated with flux, with purity and virginity, but very much femininity and changeability, but harmonious changeability, not seen from kind of like the anti-change perspective of Christianity, where all corruptibility is bad. It's more the idea that God himself, being situated on the middle pillar and at the top of the middle pillar, because he's immutable and can neither be wholly positive or wholly negative, he's very much neutral in the middle. And so therefore, when it emanates itself into the conditions of space and time, which Tiphareth is subjected to, or rather subject to, it translates itself as flux, basically. So this may also be the explanation of spiritual dryness and wetness that I think I've talked about in some other videos, how God's presence in your life seems to come and go. It doesn't seem constant, and yet that flux is actually a sign that it is constant. But that's essentially what the priestess is telling us, and this is why I think the priestess can come across as a fickle persona. Some people say that, sometimes she wants to help you, sometimes she doesn't want to help you, and sometimes she prefers secrecy and all this stuff. And I think that's kind of what it's getting at, that flux. When you think you most need God, it never seems to be there, and when you least need God, it pops up. So yeah. Okay, now I think I'm finally done. If you have anything else to say about the Priestess or any questions, comments, definitely leave them below. And I hope you found this interesting and useful. Thanks. See you next for the Empresses next. Bye.